Contemporary American Dance Museum. Today we're having a panel discussion with Stefanie Batten Bland, choreographer and creator of A Place of Sun. She is a new fellow at the Baryshnikov Art Center, and she had very successful performances up at Baryshnikov Art Center this week. One of her dancers is also on the panel, Miguel Anaya. He also took very beautiful photographs that are in this slideshow and also the slideshow on the big screen there. Jonathan Wagner did the drawings at the front of the gallery on that side. We're waiting for the co-creator of A Place of Sun, Benjamin Heller. He's uptown at BAC striking right now, but he should be down very shortly. Let's get started. So you'll have to speak into the mic, and if anyone asks a question, repeat the question, because we won't get it on the video otherwise. So should I start by asking a question, or would you like to? I would just love for you to talk a little bit about your process, maybe the beginning of the process for this piece, for A Place of Sun, and maybe the way you were inspired to make A Place of Sun is the usual way you're inspired to make a piece. Maybe it was there was a particular way for this piece in particular. And also, once you've talked about your inspiration, I'd be very interested to find out what your specific process is in rehearsal with the dancers. Do you give them material? Do they make up their own material? That sort of thing.
Hi, I'm Stefanie. I'm new at making. I'd say this is maybe my sixth piece. So I haven't found yet a standard way of making it, and I think that's a good thing. What happened in 10, I started making the transition of moving back to the States, and it was under the fellowship that we have at the Baryshnikov Art Center and through the Jerome Robbins Foundation. And it was a time period where we were working on the first of the two pieces under the fellowship. And it was, at the same time, I'd say maybe like a month into our creative process, the Gulf spill happened. And some really amazing images started floating, obviously, out into popular journalism and online. And there were a lot of images that reminded me of photos that I had actually grown up with, unfortunately. I grew up with a lot of marine biologists. My mother's a writer, and at that time she was with the Cousteau Society. And a lot of familiar, unfortunate images kept coming into my passage of vision again. And I couldn't help but notice that there was something that rung true with me when I was a kid was still ringing true with me again. And it was this idea of looking at these creatures that were sort of trying to make their way in a horrific situation, and that's something that human beings do on a daily basis, and of course most of the times we've created the very situations that we need to get ourselves out of, but in this situation here were these entities that were put into a situation, of course thanks to us, and yet they were seeking, some were going to perish, that was quite obvious, but some were going to figure out a way to get through and continue their existence if they could, and that is indeed the seedling that sort of just started an idea that then, of course, with most processes, I think for all people, spiral down till it gets to the essence. And the essence of what this all was saying to me was about adaptation and about how we're either going to adapt if we want to keep going or we're not, and we're going to stop existing. And I thought this is a wonderful thing to tackle, especially in the physical arts. In dance, we're such a time capsule, and we're such and our duration is quite limited, and it's quite short, and it's quite special, and as is life. And so I was thinking, well, I'd love to find a way to show these kinds of restrictions and constrictions and investigate those on stage, and also have those same sensations available to the people that were going to perhaps consume it, hopefully not only in a presentational way, but also in and a roundabout and research and sharing and all kinds of ideas. And so we decided, okay, well, this is the next piece that we're going to get to work on. So about a year and 8 months later, we got to really start making Sun. And Benjamin, who since last night was our last performance, we've been at the theater all day breaking things down, so he'll be on his way when he can. But we became friends roughly around the beginning of this time, and isn't that what life is, right? We meet people, we click, you don't, or you do, and we get to talking, and we realize that we actually speak the same speak, just through different mediums, and how wonderful that we could complement one another through a form and forms that we can enter and exit out of, and then also forms that we can also create ourselves. So we were dealing with two different types of vessels, one that we could enter into, and one when we were outside of became an object. And this was quite a fascinating idea, because it also allowed me to find the restrictions and the complications that I was searching for us to discuss physically. So that is about a year and a half ago, year and 8 months ago, when we started the prototypes. And we started looking and researching and playing in studios. And sometimes I'd have the gang with us, sometimes it would just be me, sometimes it would be me by myself, Miguel Anaya, or Raphael Canidou-Vauger, or Emily, whoever was really around. We would just basically start to fuss and say, you know what, we've got 2 hours here, hey, isn't this how it kind of works? You know, you call up people and you're like, listen, I've got 2 hours, come over, let's get in the studio, let's see what we can do. And that's sort of how it began, and then Mr. Brishkoff notified us that we were receiving the second year of the fellowship, and so then that allowed things to really start taking that great formal shape. So that kind of segues into the second question, or the second part of your question, which is once you realize, okay, this is really going to happen, you really realize, okay, this is going to go into the production process, this is going to be sold, this is going to be made, and this is going to be done. You get, of course, your budget together or not, or whatever, how much you can get together, and celebrate that. And then the bleeding really starts. That's when I say it all comes off. And we were able to. I work with a group of people that are exquisitely pluridisciplinary in all senses. Raphael is also the creator of a space in France that is a residency for artists of all types. And so we went to France and started making part of the eggs out there, actually, and we got to have a workshop series that was out there and allowed us to, in a very, I'd say, relaxed and encouraging frame of mind, allow us to discover what these eggs were going to feel like when we're inside of them. Because what they feel like in me is not really going to be relative to someone to my left or to my right. I can say, you know, as much as I want, hey guys, when we're small and we're hidden inside, on me, 5'10", with a lot of leg, that's going to look different on our little Jessie, who's a tiny duck, you know. And so what does that mean relative to her? And so, and for Miguel, and for all of us. So I'd say in France we got to really kind of dive into the essence of what we wanted to get into. And then we got to bring it back home, pack it up, put it in some cartons, brought it back to the city, and moved it on into Misha's. And I'd say the part 2 happened, and Benjamin had to start really designing what was going to fit the body, what was not going to work with us, what was going to not break, what was going to be fragile and actually allow us to almost potentially break. And isn't that a fascinating discussion? Because that's also one that's quite physical and what the body goes through on a daily basis as well. So that's sort of how the preparation began. Now, I think, again, it's the 6th piece, so it's not, I haven't yet decided, oh, I can only work this way or that way, but I do have a tendency to come to the group first with pictures. I come with a lot of pictures. I like to give a lot of the seating idea, but I'm also very obliged to listen to what the piece needs and what the direction that it's going to take. It's not Broadway, it's not track line work, So it's not something that's going to be sold to 7 different types of audiences on 7 different groups. It's my group, it's our group that's going to be doing it, and I think I hope that I can listen well enough to understand what the piece needs. I can come to the table with all of my ideas, but normally a piece takes on its life of its own, and I hope I guide it the right way. And I come normally with ridiculous amounts of written material and ridiculous amounts of questions, and they have lots of questions for me, and hopefully we find the answers that work out and make the journey worth it for those of us that are on stage and also off of the stage. Yay.
I have a question for Jonathan. My question is, what inspired you to want to work with dance?
She wants to know what inspired you to want to work with dance.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Wagner. For many years I've actually done a lot of different shows that have been sort of a combination of a variety of different types and styles of art, whether it be dance, which I had done several years ago back in Virginia, and then predominantly lately with jazz and different, I'm going to say hip-hop acts throughout the world, where we've done a lot of live painting instruction on stage and as a part of. When I was invited to be a part of this, what I really noticed was really with Benjamin and Stefanie, the idea of the sphere, or the egg, which, if you go way back, is really the premise of how many paintings were drawn, with the grid, the way that it came into form, and the 2 environments that were created, one inside and one outside. And Ben and I talked fairly extensively about that. So what I really tried to do was take as many different elements of what I do, which is fairly photorealistic, large-scale faces and drawings, and combine it with as many elements inside of the drawing rendering sphere. So there were lots of mediums that were used. It's really one of the few mixed media pieces that I've done, and so far there's about 4 of them, with another 4 that are coming. But it really encompassed everything that Stefanie had really, put in with the whole group. There's action shots of everyone, and one of the best pieces that I enjoyed, I was able to capture a sphere that actually had 4 of the other spheres that were inside of it with 3 of the characters. And what was great was being a part of the rehearsals and seeing some of the different changes that happened in the process of it, and seeing how everyone really interacted, because that's really, you capture that moment, and by capturing that moment, you're able to really express it your way. And as Stefanie said, what that means to me is something completely different than what it's going to mean to Stefanie or anyone else in the show. And that's really the part that I enjoy the most about creating, is just the same idea of being able to have everyone sort of come up with their own views and opinions based on what I've created. So hope that answers.
So, continuing along the lines of talking about the spheres, the eggs, from the point of view of someone who is also a dancer and and loving this feeling of being able to use my imagination and think what it was like for the dancers to be inside the egg and to dance with it. And questions came into my mind, especially at the beginning when they're in the nest, and maybe Miguel could answer this. Just from a standpoint of logistics, was it a little bit different for each person? How much did you have to work with the egg just to get in it? And when you were in it, I noticed there might be one section that was open a little more. Maybe that's where your back rested when you were laying down in the egg at the beginning. Things like that. I would love to hear about how different people worked with the egg differently.
Well, I think the experience was very different for every single person. I know for some people it was something that I think they got to work with a little earlier, so they went through the challenges earlier. So by the time we got to BAC, they were comfortable, and I would look at them and I'd be like, why do they make it look so easy? It's simple. You get in it and you think you're fine, you're in control, and you're so not. It's very fragile. It's very strong, but it's very fragile also. And you have to find yourself in it. We are so used to controlling everything. And I think this, for me, was an experience where I had to let go, and it was very hard for me because I wanted to control how it moved, but it just didn't work like that, you know, and it was something I was very frustrated in rehearsal, and I remember going home just saying, oh, I hate that egg. But then I realized once I was in it, it was this crazy, the performance, I was sitting in it, and then I was like, why am I fighting so much with something that's here? You know, it's just here. And that's what we have to do. It's just here, we listen to each other, and we move. And it's you know, it's like a relationship. It's like, it's just, we're gonna move forward, but you're gonna go on your pace, and I'm gonna go on mine, and we're gonna try and find a medium. And it really was quite a beautiful experience, I have to say. And it's funny because, like I said, I've been performing for a while, and you know, I love props, you know, or anything that I have to use with my hands or that's on stage. It's just very satisfying to me, and I love to incorporate that into my, you know, my world when I perform in. The feathers were an obstacle. I've never done that, but that was another learning experience. And you know, I can't speak for everyone, but for me, it definitely was a very, very intimate experience, and it's something that I definitely would love to continue to, you know, search. And there's so much more to come out of it. That's the amazing thing about it. I feel like I just learned my first steps in it. I haven't even ran with it yet, you know, and that's the exciting part. And the exciting is it's still it can take more life, you know, and it's very exciting for me. Yeah, so yeah.
Maybe, Stefanie, you could talk a little bit about what it's like to work on two continents. That's very exciting and interesting, I think. Are there differences with the dancers, with communicating with them, with the different audiences?
Well, it's funny. I think it's something that we actually do all the time. But for some reason in our craft, we've decided that there's one sort of model that works, even though it's quite outdated now. And gracious, we, as dancers, performers, artists, people, we're in 747s or A-bus 380s or whatever, you know, I mean, every other day. So it's funny because we're constantly already always on several continents, and we're constantly working and slipping into other people's skins all over the world. But it's true, I happened to begin this while I was still working and living abroad, and I met amazing people over there, and I didn't see, just because I was coming home, why I had to stop that, you know. And sure, there's no money. Okay, well, hey, you know what, there never was, so that's not a problem. So you take that, and you take the fact that you have great people. Let's just change up the model a little bit. I mean, let's just, hey, what does HSBC do? Well, they just make it work. They make it happen. Well, so can we. So what we were able to do is, I go back and forth quite a lot, indeed, and I just kind of refuse to mold into what I think we consider, even though I still say it's out of date, any kind of normal 32-week, 37-week standard. Everybody in this group is extremely committed to their own projects, which is why they're such exciting people. And so that when we actually come together, the sparks and the magic and the fire that happens, I think, is because we're so fulfilled in all of our pie of life. And it allows us actually to allocate to our slice of time together that's probably now, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, you know, as much energy as we can and do to it. The magic might not actually be the same if it was, you know, all year round. I don't know. But each continent is quite special and quite similar. We are not the best of listeners. We're great talkers over here, but we're not necessarily the best of listeners. And that's also a physical trait that I've found in us as well. So when I get to work with Europeans and we get to mix these elements together, which this is all based, of course, between money and time and how the two are used. Even though Europe is completely changing, it's still a feel of like the 80s money-wise, thus time-wise. A rehearsal can still be 8 hours with all of the various breaks, and thus the pressure of creating a product to sell so that you can create another product isn't the same type of pressure. Though it is going to get there in about 10 years. It will be exactly the same to here, unfortunately. I'd say because of that, there's a different listening. And I don't necessarily mean in respect to audio sensations, but to one another, to your goal that you're going after risk-wise. You're open to take risks because your failure is not going to have a financial burden or consequence to what's happening. And this is a really interesting state of mind to create in. So how do you meld those two worlds together? Because what happens over here is the attack and the fire attack that we have, and the ability to use such a short amount of time so productively. You put these two kinds of worlds together and you really get something quite magical. You get the listening, you get the fire, you get the provocation, and you also get a sense of being. And really this sense of being is the one that I've been pretty much after most always. And this group seems to make it happen, and it's definitely the one that interests me the most. I get a very wonderful sense of our vitality as people, our interconnectedness, and that's what makes me go. And I think that's why I love this. And in comes Mr. Heller. Hey, B.
Just in time for my next question, which is how did you get the eggs back and forth?
Well, I just got done taking the eggs back and forth. I just got done with that. Actually, physically, I'm still wet, but they're constructed. You know, I mean, I don't know if we talked about the construction. They're all what? We haven't talked about them at all. Okay. Well, I'm gonna start by talking about them a little bit. They are they're a structure that's created entirely. You know, they're held together really by tension, and there's a, you know, they're engineered with the circles are static, and they're cut concentric circles from a single sheet of very high quality birch plywood, which is there's a piece that is shown on the wall back there, which is actually where the eggs come from. So they're a flat sheet, and they're cut in concentric circles and beveled and sanded and everything like that. And part of the design in thinking about the structure and thinking about the structure in terms of mobility, both from the skeletal nature of how it moves, and then also how it can move through the world and go anywhere. I thought of the design as from that concentric sheet, they eventually get strapped into a like a board, and that can go into a box with like a CD crate, and then the reed gets turned back into its bales and can go in a suitcase, so they can really go anywhere in terms of moving and dancing and things like that. So I just got done with that process, and there's, you know, one over the shoulder is pretty light, and a few is a little heavier. They get heavier as you multiply them, but they're actually quite, you know, quite mobile. They take a bit to put together, less to take apart. So does that answer the question? Good. Oh. What's the next question? What?
Does anyone in the audience have a question?
To continue the discussion about the eggs creation, though, what are the rods made of?
The rods? I could probably talk loud too. Can everybody hear me? Okay, well we got video feed. They're reed, and they come from they're rattan reed, which is you know, it's very similar to bamboo, except for it's like a core of bamboo. Bamboo comes as a tube. So they're very pliable and malleable. They're very light, and when they're wet, and we keep them as a, you know, as a sculpture. They don't need to be, but as one that's you know, when the dancers use them or they're inhabited, we keep them moist, and we found that really that, you know, the material doesn't break at all when it's wet. It's very, very tough and very, very malleable, but the structure keeps it in line. So it's, you the tensions stay well. So. And that material is really kind of part of what makes it possible. The holes in the structure guide that curve, and it's really kind of an amazing material to work with because it's very light. I worked on a project previous to this, which is what made me discover what made this possible, and I was looking for a light material that would keep a curve, like a natural curve, without kinking, without being heavy, without doing that. So it's a really an amazing material, and I don't know that there's anything else quite like it.
You just repeat the question. I could see that the spacing of the holes was planned and designed.
Mm-hmm.
Did you calculate an angle for the holes to go through the hoops, or were they all perpendicular?
The hoops, I mean, when I was initially exploring how to create the shapes, you know, there's kind of a nice, there's a proportion to it, and some of that is, you know, some of that's like, in the whole process of creating these pieces, there's an aspect of it that's intuitive, and then there's an aspect of it that's like experimental engineering. So, you know, we start with intuition, and then I've tested that intuition. So, you know, the very first prototype, you know, I cut straight, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't work. And so, you know, and in the second one, which is actually in the photographs, which if you look closer, you'll notice is very different than the ones behind you, in terms of how elegantly it's finished. I looked at an egg, and I found, you know, those angles, and they're 0, 15, 30. They're just cascading, you know, double, you know, 15 times. So those are all cut on a radial, straight, with like on a jig. So that's what controls them, and if they're off, it'll change the angle.
I'd like to ask, and I think probably everyone on the panel could speak to this, about the experience from both sides of being on the dance floor working and observing so you can do your artwork. And Miguel can speak to both sides of that. I think that's very interesting. Maybe we'll go down the line, sir. Jonathan.
You know, it was after doing a lot of the rehearsals, I went to about 3 of them and watching everything that was done. It actually took to the final day of the performance to find the perfect picture of the show. And Benjamin, Stefanie were standing up on the rafter, both absolutely absorbed in everything that was going on right towards the end, and I was able to get both of them really not paying attention to anything other than everything that they had just created. If I had had the time, I would have loved to have created that piece because it really exemplified just all the effort, all the time, and everything that was there. And plus, you know, watching all the rehearsals, I was sort of happy not to have had to deal with the feathers either, because to sit there with a little micron pen at a 0.00 leading, or 0.3 leading, makes it a little bit difficult. But, you know, it was great to see the shapes, to learn how they were created, and to really see people as an extension of the form itself. You know, you had, you know, legs coming out of a skeleton of a sphere that allowed for 2 environments, as I said before, to really be, you know, exemplified. You had what was going on inside, and then you had what was going on outside. And to really be as far removed as I was, not really knowing a lot of what went into the piece and how it was formed, to be able just to see that and to be able to connect with that personally and just visually was something that was, you know, it was very enjoyable, and it was a great exercise because the pieces were actually very, very detailed, and I could only imagine how much time was spent on perfecting, you know, the actual structure to let people sit in and, you know, work in, and keep practicing in, because, you know, as you mentioned before, there was a wider opening, which just looked like it was difficult because everyone's different inside. I know Stefanie had mentioned, you know, certain people were taller, certain people were shorter, and those gave, you know, great amounts of variance to the way that people were structured inside of them. So to go in and, for me, I worked with very skinny lines, very thick lines. For me, the idea of laying down work is very mark oriented. So the mark making I tried to put together as closely as I could to, you know, the thicker pieces of wood as well as, you know, the skinnier pieces of wood and all the different dancers and the bodies associated with each piece. So that was, I answered that correctly, but.
In terms of, we were talking about inside, outside, and right. I think, I guess, you know, I created the first one, and it's been a really fascinating experience working with all kinds of different bodies. I created bodies that are, I first created this, and you know, like I was the first, I tested it, and I put it together, and I was like, okay, does this really, how does this work? Does this really?
So you got inside.
Can this really work? Yeah, I got inside. And, which is kind of a funny picture. Because I just had knee surgery, actually, so I still was like, But anyway, it's that's a funny story. I don't know if it belongs here, but I was excited to get inside. And I'm gonna wait. But I created the first one, and some of the feeling of, and it's interesting because I had the first experience personally of the structure feeding back. The structure, you know, the structure is like this. It's a setup and a situation of an idea that becomes a physical reality, and so by getting inside of that, it becomes physicalized, and it started. You know, it's like I get inside, and it's no longer an idea. It actually becomes a thing. And so the first thing when I get inside is that I'm like, oh, this kind of is going to hold my body, and it feels like this space I've created that's separate from the room. Even though you can see through it, even though I can see outside, there's a space inside that felt very, very different than anything I'd ever experienced before. So that, you know, and how do I move? Some of the ideas, the theoretical ideas of how I could move, and it came from other kind of movements. This is probably a long answer for me, because that's the first moment, and then so we created this thing, and it's like, okay, this works. I get to call Stefanie, and then Stefanie got in, and she started, you know, and her voice that comes from her body starts talking to the structure, and the structure talks back, and you say, well, what do we find in here? Where does this happen? And we get more images. And so there's a richness, and I look at this all as a conversation. Like even when I start like with the read, it's like there's an image, but then as soon as I start creation, it becomes a conversation with gravity, with the world, with the materials, with, you know, all of those things. And so it's been a really rich process, and surprising actually to me, in some ways, to go through that process with so many different people. The eggs are scaled a little bit, and we had to adjust them to work with different bodies. And it's kind of an adventure and a journey for everyone. And it's been a really, really rich conversation just to hear people's what happens on the way. And I think that really, that journey and that experience informs the piece, and it becomes shareable in a way.
On stage, off stage, I think is what the end is for me, because in the end, everyone gets to participate and discover and share the same thing that we've been working and doing for 40 minutes, and that's the magical moment where it's no longer about us and how we feel with them. It's what we all do with them, and that's I think that's the moment where the community is made, and the on-stage, off-stage really gets to bind, and that's the on-stage, off-stage part of it for me.
As a performer in photographing within the piece, it became very frustrating towards the end, because once we started to dealing with inside of the egg, it became a whole different thing for me as a performer, as a dancer. And I didn't have time that I did before, where I could run around and try to catch moments everywhere with the camera. And I wanted to have the camera with me at all times. I mean, I wanted to have it around my neck, inside of the egg, all the time, during the show. Because it was just a very different experience, you know, and photographically, this is something I started doing just recently. I mean, I say recently, but confidently recently. This offered such a rich introduction to, you know, to everything, to the piece, to just everything.
You know something that Benjamin was just I want to just lightly go back to the photo that Benjamin was just talking about, because this is, when I say a year and 8 months, this was probably a photo from October of 11. No, the knee. When was the knee? 10? 10, 11.
That was like
February. I mean, this is what I think is so magical about Benjamin, and why we click, but for sure, I mean, I don't know, I got a text at, I don't know, like 9 in the morning, and you know, it's of him like this, and it says, "Steph, look, I'm in." And I'm like, and I get this text, and I'm like, give me 10 minutes, I'll be there. I mean, that's the kind of excitement that this made, and that this makes, and that I think why it's so amazing to be here this amount of time later, because I think when you realize that you're in the beginning of a different type of language, a different type of way of communicating, a different type of way of sharing, your hairs go up. A spark starts to go through you, because you're like, we're onto something here, and it's something that really, it's blurring definitions, and it's blurring a lot of things that really need to be blurred now, because we are not just you know, blue and green. There's a lot of yellow, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the meat that I think might be getting lovely boxes and definitions get made quite often, and I think we realized that we were onto something that was plucking the lids off. And when you can start kicking lids off, go 100% with it, because suddenly everyone's searching for this very definition that they needed so badly, and you realize actually it's always been there, because you don't really need it, because you just are.
What? Oh, we could probably talk about. I could probably talk about that a little bit. No, it's always interesting when we think about what are we, what am I, in terms of being creators. It's like it's very interesting how the lines draw, and like, are we, you know, I'm a performer who becomes a photographer. You know, we follow these threads, and it's like, I'm a performer who becomes a photographer, who becomes a sculptor, who, you know, and all of these things are really interconnected, because they're really interconnected. I mean, there's only so much time, there's only so much little hands can do, but there's so much interconnection, and I think what I'm really interested in is finding how these things meet. Where do these things meet? Like, and what can come out of them? And it's a kind of a new place, a new, you know, I don't know. It's a different place. I think it's really interesting where that, rather than just making like something that stays static, because the nature, I think, of how we perceive and how we feel and how we live is in that, in what we traverse. So I think that this piece engages that, and how to, you know, what happens, you know, when we enter, we have a conversation with the unknown and we find new things.
I realized that photographically, I am very inclined with the dancers because it's such an intimate world for me. I spend so much time with them, with movement, laying on the floor, looking at people going over stuff, how they solve things. I find it very fascinating, but also what I find fascinating is, like you said, creators. This is what makes me want to do what I do. You know, Stephanie's doing, Benjamin is doing, and they're doing it in front of me, and all I want to do is just capture all of it. So as a dancer, it's great to be able to do one voice and to see, you know, just how as a dancer I can also have a different voice for what's happening as a narrator. That's kind of how I see the photography. You know, because I wouldn't approach it any different. I mean, it's very intimate, this whole kind of symbiotic thing that happens with photography, because it's an internal thing that's happening as I'm in it, you know. And as a photographer, we're always away, you know, or outside of what's happening, and it's in our minds, inside of us. But with this, I'm actually in it, and it almost feels like it's, you know, like we are participating in something together, which is very exciting to me, you know.
There's something that comes from, there's like in the dance, I think part of the work that I'm talking about with how things meet and is like that idea of coming from the inside out instead of the outside in, and what happens when we talk about images that take us over and that we come from, you know. And I think that's a bit what Miguel's talking about with that process of, because you have an intimate, we're talking about that intimate space and about that intimate kind of creation where, because you have that knowledge, there's not, there's just there's an intuition of what you're, I find that because there's a knowledge of directly engaging with the experience, there's a different intuition where the disciplines cross, and where the disciplines feed each other, and where, you know, there's a kind of feeling about when, because you know in your muscle memory when something happens, when the decisive moment of an action is, there's sometimes a different way of capturing that motion, because there's a, I think sometimes it's actually the moment after the moment. And if, like, sometimes when I do photography of dance, when I'm thinking about it, the mind doesn't work fast. The mind really doesn't work fast enough. It's like the body. It's the intuition of the body that's actually shooting at the right moment. And sometimes when I shoot, you know, performance or dance or things like that, it's almost like sometimes I'm like, what did I just do?
It's almost like if you think it's late.
If you think it's late,
yeah.
And that's
thought about it in the first place,
yeah.
you know, it just
And I think one of the frustrating and rewarding things that happens within this piece and within the structure is that it puts you in that place a little bit. I think it takes, it's like, I think this is what it's going to be like, and then wait, it's like this, and suddenly, like, but I want to go here, and it says no. So it's like there's this new way, and that's, and it's actually by getting inside that space. And I think that's how they naturally cross. Like, there's natural progressions where we cross where these disciplines meet and where we cross them. Is a natural kind of progression. Where because we've done one thing, we spend this time here, and we want to go to the other side. I'm losing my.
Oh, I just thought you might have something to add. Does anyone else have a question?
Would you talk about how you chose this particular piece of music for the work, and whether you set the piece to the music or the music to the work?
Again, another great accident. While I was working in Poland, I got to discover Karol Szymanowski's work, and a composer that I had heard very little about other than piano works. And I was looking for sound. I don't know, Mom. I don't even know if I knew what I was looking for, right? These are kind of the moments when the best things happen, when you're just kind of open to, we're just open to receive how things come across our paths. It was a total accident discovering this. Karol Szymanowski was a composer from Warsaw, 19 teens, 20s circa, quite overlooked, of course, due to what Stravinsky was doing and what the right was doing in Paris at that time. And a lot of his piano works have just started coming to the forefront of maybe 10 years now. And this was a choral piece. And there was something quite pure about what we were working on in terms of ideas. And there's something extremely pure of the human voice. And they talked to me, it spoke to me, it screamed at me, and it was the first time that I was going to use a complete oeuvre. And the entire 6 poems of the mother crying, and of course in the time that this was being made, I think that country was also going through a huge fight because World War I was right on the cusp, or was coming right on up, and I think there was a lot of national identity crises that were going on, and I think this was ended up being music that was quite nationalistic for them, and sort of became a country's cry. And part of what was fascinating to me about how we coexist and adapt is, I think, the body and human beings actually cry out in terms of finding their own struggle to coexist with themselves and their environment. And they made sense. So no, I don't ever make on things. It makes together. I've been walking around with this piece of music probably for the same amount of time, the idea. So they really both kind of happened at the same time. So it was a pretty great accident.
Maybe each of you could speak a little bit about your thoughts about the mission of the Contemporary American Dance Museum and how it relates to your work.
I had brought it up a little bit briefly. I think the idea of all the various aspects of the arts, dance, writing, music, rendering, painting, run down the gamut of it. I think that there's all a very similar way that we all get started working on a piece. You can't get from point X without going through point A, B, and C. It just doesn't happen. But by putting together a lot of different ideas, a lot of different artists, a lot of different processes, you find that in the layers, there's a lot of similarities between everybody. Some of my best conversations are with composers. I go about doing a painting by, laying down what I call the skeleton or the structure. Certain composers will lay down, certain bass notes and bass ideas, or don't know much about choreography, but I would imagine that it starts off at a very simplistic point, and it just gets evolved and expanded based on the people that you're working with and influenced by. And that's really, where I see a lot of the organization going, is by bringing in as many different sides of the quote-unquote art world. It leaves you with the ability to just achieve something. It's really a culmination of everyone working together, and I don't want to say the word unified front, but in a front that just pushes forth the idea of a free exchange of ideas that are creative, and moving that towards a better place in terms of all different types of art. Photography is going to be needed with any type of theatrical performance. You're going to have to be able to take that. And now with all the advents in videography and animations and all of that, I only see an idea like this going into thousands of different directions, depending on where Stefanie and Ben want to take that, and where some of the other projects go. But I think bringing in as many different people as possible, with as many different disciplines, can only manifest in you know, the best of the artistic endeavors that are around.
I think that I don't know. I feel like I can only really speak to my side of the work. I guess that I think it's interesting to engage in. I mean, I think it's interesting to engage in conversation about the process, and to. It's interesting to open that process up to engagement with other people, and to open up that thing. Sometimes it's. I think sometimes the way of. I think there's a lot of different. There's a lot of different ways of, I think, engaging with how do we document the process, and I think some of those are, some like work better than others. One of the first rules, actually, of my art practice is that it's not a documentary, and that part of what I work with is just like it's not a documentary. And even when I make documentary work, it follows the rule that it's not a documentary. And documenting is very important, and it's documenting is kind of hugely important in the way that we're doing the world, because more often nobody sees anything, they see documentation. So it's like there's in the advent of the virtual world, sometimes it's more important how something's documented than it's kind of a wild thing. And I often get involved in documentation because I'm a photographer, and that, there's a lot of, like the pieces that we created, we're really kind of creating as pieces. Initially, we're creating as pieces in the studio, and they're not necessarily thought of as like documentation of a process, but they become, it's that conversation, that we have to record to be able to share for the most part. So we create work that's in the studio, and it's like we're creating photographs, but we're creating performance at the same time. And I mean, because they meet each other naturally. One can't quite, they coexist. So, as far as those works, like that active, we try to find something, and then because we can see it, or because we can hold on, because we can share, we say, oh, that's interesting, let's go here. Or we remember, or those things. So I think it's interesting how that process actively is part of, those things. And it's fun to share those things all in, or I think it's very interesting to put those together as a whole. Like we've spent all this time creating, like piece by piece by piece, like one little thing at a time, we've created this body, we've created this world. So, and it's just happened one little piece by one little piece. We started, we've got these feathers. It's like, what do they do? And, and that's really kind of been the process. So that's incremental in like those documents. And I mean, it is an interesting question of how do we bring more of the experience? How do we bridge more of the experience of creation into the work that we make, and how do we let people inside of it, in all senses?
And I think the museum will do this and is doing this. I think this is really the idea. I think the minute you can make a bridge for people to discover how things are made and make it more accessible for people to come with their families and discover not just the finished product, but hey, what went into it, is a wonderful idea. And for a genre, especially the physical arts, where I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, where people tend to shy away from because we're not speaking, even though it's the essence of everything that we do, it can bring up uncomfortable sensations in people. So to make that even more accessible to people, how wonderful is that? For little kids to be able to see ideas interpreted by others throughout a process for 6 weeks, 2 years, however long a process is. This is a great opportunity to be able to share and open up our doors to a larger audience. I think
it's a great great idea. I mean, to document and to keep this modern, you know, not to have to know someone who's a modern dancer. Are you a dancer, like behind dancers, like with artists? You know, I feel that it's something that is, how can I explain this? Okay. The first reason why I wanted to dance was from seeing a photograph. And that changed my whole world. And having a museum that has that for anyone who comes in and sees that this really does exist. It's not something that people do somewhere far away. You know, people really dedicate their lives to do this, to make change, and you know, to empower. So I think it's wonderful. I think it's a wonderful idea, Alice.
Does anyone, thank you so much for those thoughtful comments. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Benjamin, was it you or Stefanie that thought of the feathers? And I wanted to ask Miguel if it was difficult to dance. I've been to 2 performances, and I was just amazed how you dancers managed to get through those feathers and nobody slipped or anything. And the other thing is that I just love the idea at the end of passing the wonderful nests up through the audience. I just thought that was simply wonderful. And I think it was just a perfect ending for the piece. And the music also was just extraordinary. It was really wonderful. I wondered also, in the music, some of the parts didn't have music. Why was that decision made?
I think, what's the first question? I think it was like Stefanie brought the feathers and I brought the egg. So, collaboration, you know? And that's kind of like, it's like, I'll create the, well, you know, like, I'll create the structure, you fill it. It's like, it just makes it, I think that's how it goes. And, you know, I think at the moment we decided to start working on a project together, it was kind of like I'd had, you know, this other thing, and it kind of in a strange, it kind of gone in a funny direction, and then which I was kind of upset about, and then about a week later I met Steph, and she was like, you know, I really want to work on this thing. I was like, you know, I've got the feathers, and it's like, and I was like, oh, huh. I was like, oh, well, maybe that's the thing that I'm so upset about. Maybe it's perfect. And you know, it's funny. It's funny how that happens with the creative process, because you know, there's questions and there's answers at all times, and there's, you know, and often we're only, you know, there's an intuition that's followed by another thing, or there's a, you know, there's material, and it's like, oh wow, that's really inspiring, and it tells me what it does. It's really interesting what, I mean, I don't want to make comparisons to the obvious, which came first, but it's, and it's like my favorite answer to that question is just that it is. It's like the nature of the whole, you know, we're always, creativity is response, we're always responding, and it whirls all together. And the question, and then you had the other question about the silence. I personally love silence. And I think, you know, some of those things, you know, Stefanie has this music, and I think that we have, like, I think some of it's because you have these movements and then you have these rests. And sometimes, as far as it works, I mean, you probably have your whole own, like it, you know, we're kind of, there's a couple different states. All of our life happens between awakening and rest, everything. So those 2 states are very interesting to me. And so sometimes between silence, the spaces that we find between silence and the music is very strong. And then sometimes those silence, at different points in the creative process, we've talked about like, how long is it? How much road do we have in terms of the oeuvre of this music? And then in that process, I think when we were working with it in France, we started thinking about the sounds, because there's not always, I mean, it's not really silence. We go from this music to the sound of the presence of the dancers, and the presence of, and there's so many dynamics that are happening, and that actually becomes the sound. And I think it's an interesting, change. It's an interesting conversation.
Sound fills space in so many different ways, right? So we have, especially with this piece that he's written, there are very intimidating moments. There are very intimate, private moments. There are very quiet moments. And then there's the very fragile discussion of the egg and the body and us. And they make their most exquisite sounds themselves. So does the complication of the feathers, which obliges us. Most of my pieces, I've noticed, have a problem. And the feathers, honestly, were a wonderful problem as well, because we were really quite obliged to change how we dealt with our breath, so that we could A, not suffocate, B, not choke, C, not cough, and D, create new pathways in space, which is actually what the feathers were allowing us to do. They were allowing us to take our coexisting partners with whom we were dancing with on stage through a different territory. And the feathers created several different textures and layers and dimensions of territory. And one of the best ways to make them mobile and to move them was with the breath, which was with the exhale, which also has an extraordinary sound because it's a forceful exhale sound. Specifically when they were small breaths so that we could make a pathway, or whether they're long breaths so that you can clear a large space so that then Emily could proceed and have stable environment for her arabesque, for example. Totally functional, practical, something that happens, right? But indeed, silence is so important before and after sound, because it's what envelops it. And I think a lot of what's been going on, a lot of the world that I inhabited as a dancer was extremely sound oriented. Now, a lot of my existence, thanks to my pops, was only sound oriented. And to grow up with atonal music as a child, you're either going to come out psychotic or, addicted to coffee or something, what I mean? and who knows how, but I came out with a really great curiosity of sound. And so since we are using something that is so dramatic and wrenchingly emotional, sometimes the simplicity of just the breath is a wonderful vacation that we need in the piece, which allows the piece to continue. Thank
you. Any final questions or comments?
Thank you. So looking around here, I noticed that the artists in interpreting the work took different points of view, whether like this painting here to try to give a similar message as the dance, or whether in some of them over there to capture some of the technical, physical aspects of the dance. And I just wondered what the experience was like for the creator and the dancer to see their art reinterpreted one step further beyond them by these other artists, and what they've brought to it. And for the artists, I wonder if they had any modifications to their technique they had to think about to try to capture the essence of this creative process.
So far, since coming back to the States, I've been surrounded by Miguel, Anaya, and Benjamin Heller. I mean, and as a result of that, we've I've become, and the group has become extraordinarily comfortable, open, giving, not guarded at all, because we're all taking the same risks together, and that allows us all to be quite open with one another. I am often thoroughly blown away. Actually, I normally always am, with how I see Miguel seeing us, how I see Benjamin seeing us, and it has, honestly, it's just a joy to see, because it has nothing, in a way, it has nothing to do with me. Do you know what I mean? I literally get to discover sides of the dance and of our work and of our daily work, process that I never thought of or have the time to think of, because truly, I mean, our stage experience is what, 15% of what we do. The rest of our percentage of what we do is daily working, discovering, searching in the studio environment, besides training, health, etc. So it's been, and I did not come here a single time, before last night, and I had no idea what I was going to see, and it's actually how I really wanted it as well, because I think it's really the duty for each person who is following us and who's going to speak, not necessarily to me, but who's going to speak to these people that are going to come to this museum and going to discover what the process is. That's really, for me, who it's for. And so it was wild. It was wild. I was sort of like with my mouth open the whole night, kind of just like looking, because I know Miguel, I know Benjamin. I kind of knew what I thought I might see, which of course I was wrong there too, so that's great. And it was just so great to be wrong, and it was so great to just be in full discovery of other people.
Having to do an artistic piece without really being involved with any of the process that came through really left for a lot of trying to think about what to include in there. It was my interpretation, but my interpretation of something that was very technical, something that someone had spent a tremendous amount of time on. So I tried to put myself as close as I could into that section, and really, I normally do very large-scale paintings. So for me to do black and white drawings was a very different step, and for me to take it a couple steps further and use almost microscopic ink lines, I felt blended in perfectly with the idea of the shape, the short steps, some of the movements that were there. They were just highly detailed. Again, I'm very thankful I wasn't there to include the feathers, but the feathers were absolutely such a great addition to the piece, because it really added almost a fluid layer. I remember watching the show, and I was back fairly, up. And when you saw the feathers on the ground, they were moving. They didn't stop. And it's very similar to, when I paint, I'll use dark lights and midtones, and if you lay them down the right way with the right shadows, you get that same type of fluidity that was there. So it was interesting to watch, and I think even coming up with the idea that breathing was what was going to be what moved things around to give it a path, they didn't stop moving. I remember watching it last night. It was just, you didn't know where they were going to stick, number one, just with how energized everyone was. I would imagine just body sweat and heat kept a lot of these things affixed to everyone, and it almost, they would come on, they'd come off, they'd come on, they'd come off. And it was really interesting to see, because you have to have that type of detail, from a distance and from up close to really put that in. So in a lot of the pieces that I did, one in particular, during one of the practices, Stefanie was in one of the eggs, Miguel was in another one, and I forget the other performers. But I wanted to get as many as possible inside of, to try to give it that type of detail, and to try to really, spend as much time on the egg, as much time on the figure, as much time on the movement, to really, capture the detail that I, know that you guys put into the entire performance. And the only thing that I wasn't around to see was, when we were there, or for the rehearsals that I was there for, everyone was just in black. There was not the white flooring, and the lighting hadn't been set. So everyone was doing that. once the lighting came in and the silhouettes, you know, started to appear, that was just a complete other dynamic that was there. So I think that there's just an endless amount of pieces that can come from, you know, what you guys created. Thank you.
Any final comments from the panel? I think then that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you.